They are not real people. It's a distortion. It's a lie.
I wish I was in the land of cotton, old times there, I'm not forgotten. Look away, look away, look away, Dixieland, in Dixieland where I was born in earth.
With the kind of distortions and propaganda that are emanating from the oath in the Oval Office, the Manhattan Mussolini, the Tangerine Man, Agent Orange himself, Mr. Donald J. Trump. This is a case of chickens coming home to roost. That is to say, it was inevitable that if you have a class of individuals like you do have in this country, who give short shrift to every revolutionary process on planet Earth, except what happened in 1776, that's not a sustainable position. That's unsustainable.
How many people in this room have ever owned a slave? I see no hands. Robert E. Lee's family, the people that exist today, they never owned slaves either. Slavery is not our fault. We have no responsibility for it. It is part of our shared history. And that's what we can't walk away from.
Here I am standing on the very same land where my ancestor had worked as a young preteen, and now that's heavy. It was something that brought tears to my eyes to say, my God, my God.
This is a case of chickens coming home to roost.
The boys were routinely whipped to force them to be more productive.
That happened while Jefferson was on Monticello. It happened when he was gone, because in the 18th century, you couldn't run a plantation without using violence.
The left is attempting to destroy that beautiful vision and divide Americans by race in the service of political power. By viewing every issue through the lens of race, they want to impose a new segregation, and we must not allow that to happen.
But in any case, if the federal government is to be involved in the business of education, certainly it has a stake in people not learning false history and pseudo-history, and history directly designed to undermine the foundations of the United States.
Whereas my work on 1776, which I dare say is reflected in the 1619 Project and also reflected in Ishmael Reed's work as well, the Black population did not engage in class collaboration and side with their slave owners, such as George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and Patrick Henry, in fighting British rule in 1776. Instead, once again, overwhelmingly by several orders of magnitude, they tended to side with the British, the Redcoats. That was also manifested during the War of 1812, when the Black population joined the Redcoats in helping to sack and plunder and pillage Washington, D.C., sending James Madison, the U.S. president, and his garrulous spouse, Dolly, fleeing into the street, one step ahead of the posse, and then the Black population boards British vessels and sailed to liberty in Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean, where their descendants continue to reside. And so that is part of the accurate and true history. I think that many of our friends on the left, they feel that it's important for the various sectors of the electorate to be on the same page. And so therefore we should have a similar view of the origins of this so-called republic. The problem with that particular approach is that it's not accurate. As I said, overwhelmingly, the Black people did not support the founding of the United States, which is one of the reasons we face so much hell since then.
What are the specific reasons, whether they're misinformed or not, that they may feel offended?
Because South Heritage had slavery. I mean, that's a fact.
Okay,
that's probably why they're offended.
Let them finish the conversation.
When the war wasn't about slavery, I can't help that history teachers are teaching that. I can't.
One of the most amazing books you will ever see. Written in 1839, Slavery as It Is. And the only thing these people did was to go to newspapers, cut out articles about slavery, and put them in a book. That's why they called it Slavery as It Is. And so I want to show you the real Andrew Jackson, because he had a slave that ran away, and he wasn't having that. So he put an ad in the newspaper, stop the runaway, and he offered a $50 reward. That's not what I want to talk to you about. It's the end of this newspaper advertisement put in by Andrew Jackson near Nashville, state of Tennessee. And this is what it says. If you find that slave, $10 extra for every 100 lashes any person will give him, to the amount of 300. When people say folks didn't fight the Civil War about slavery, they weren't about defending slavery. This is years before the Civil War. This is slavery as it is. Everyone knew that this is what slavery was about. There weren't any questions about it. He's on the $20 bill. And if he's on the $20 bill and he's a horrible, horrible person, what does that mean? Does that mean we have to take him off the $20 bill? Does that mean we have to start thinking about why we put him there in the first place? I don't want to deal with that. He's a great president. Well, these are the facts about Andrew Jackson that I'd ask you to consider. And that third one especially. And I want to give you a little bit more detail about that. But here's what our President of the United States has said about Andrew Jackson. And I'm going to read this. Had Andrew Jackson been a little bit later, you wouldn't have had the Civil War. He was a very tough person, but he had a big heart. And he was really angry that he saw what was happening with regard to the Civil War. He said, there's no reason for this. The problem with it is, the first problem, that Andrew Jackson was dead 16 years before the Civil War started. And I know it is. It's like, are you kidding me? But it's like as funny as a heart attack, because there are people who believe this. And this is part, you're saying like, oh, that's ridiculous, nobody believes that. We are in 2017 and we're having a debate about what the Civil War meant. If you think that who controls the past is not important, you are wrong. Think about the arguments that we're having in this country today, and it's because the past has been concealed.
What do we say to people who say that they find the flag to be insulting? In what way does that stand? Like, in here, who finds does anybody in this room find the flag insulting?
Jefferson professed to hate slavery, called it an abominable crime, but he held on to his slaves. He freed only 7.
The author of the Declaration of Independence, who wrote that all men are created equal, owned 600 slaves over his lifetime.
And my question is, why are we so unwilling to listen? Why are we so unwilling to believe exactly what they're telling us? This is my favorite. All white men are, and of right ought to be, entitled to equal civil and political rights, that the servitude of the African race, as it existing in the states, is mutually beneficial to both bond and free, and is abundantly authorized and justified by the experience of mankind and the revealed will of the Almighty Creator. Do you think that they stopped believing this because the war was over? They are telling you as clearly as they can. At the South, and with our people, of course, slavery is the element of all value, and the destruction of that destroys all that is property. This is why we are willing to send our fathers and brothers and sons to make war on the North to try and separate our country. Because if we don't, you're taking away our very lifeblood. We need these slaves, and we are comfortable with it, and we thought you were too.
Is Thomas Jefferson any less great because the understanding we have of him now is three-dimensional?
So we have our president saying The history and culture of our great country is being ripped apart by the removal of beautiful statues. You can't change history, but you can learn from it. Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, who's next? Washington, Jefferson. And it's so foolish, and also the beauty that is being taken out of our cities and towns will be greatly missed and never able to be comparably replaced. I have an easy way for you to think about this.
Was that slavery was okay because they thought it was moral, but slavery was never moral. And so you linking someone to be able to go to the hospital and being able to afford their cancer treatment has nothing to do with slavery being okay back in the South.
And owning people.
Owning people will never be okay. And so I feel like when you say that you'll only take parts of the flag, of the Confederate flag, you forget that like it also acknowledges the fact that slavery is okay. And so I feel like if you say that someone's pushing you, like who exactly is pushing you? Just like
although that did happen a lot, again, deny nothing about how disgusting slavery was. Is this flag to these Americans what this flag is to these Americans? Or more accurately, is this flag to these Americans, and to these guys and some other guys? Talk about what this flag stood for generations after the Civil War. That how both flags have a racist history that we're trying to pretend away. This flag was also the flag of slavery. And for 100 years of segregation, this flag strictly limited immigration from non-white countries. This flag treated Nazi POWs better than Japanese and black American citizens during World War II. This flag overthrows democratically elected governments. This flag did whatever the hell this was. Now don't freak out. I love this flag.
Okay, so there's a video that is going around on Facebook and on YouTube. It's from ACT TV called Systemic Racism Explained.
I'm going to try to dismiss the subject.
In all fairness, you should explain to the audience why it is that you have, first of all, you have a very large segment of the black population who are on farms, who are deprived in cities. Why don't you explain at the time that you're showing this, who is keeping black people in a situation like they're in? I mean, it could be, you could turn it around the other way, where you could have very large numbers of black people who are exposed to educational opportunities like white people, who are exposed to housing, who are exposed to health facilities. Why don't you explain that at the same time that you put figures like that?
I'm sure you would explain it,
no, but
Dr.
I think
Welsing,
it's important
but
in
one must say first things first. And you've raised the basic question there, and that is whether the disadvantages are primarily a lack of opportunity or whether they are primarily a basic genetic difference.
You can see evidence of systemic racism in every area of life. The disparities in family wealth, incarceration rates, political representation, and education are all examples of systemic racism.
Now we reach the crux of the matter. The basic idea
I think there is another word that better describes what I'm involved in, and that word is race-ology.
This publication is put out by the Southern Poverty Law Center. I would encourage you to get it. You can get it online. It has amazing information about the monuments that have been erected in America and where they are and when they were put up. Those are the top 10 states with the most monuments. Come from their study. About 1,503 monuments, and they're still counting. They haven't gotten them all. 109 public schools, 80 counties, 9 official Confederate holidays, and 10 United States military bases. Can you imagine that at a United States of America military base housing U.S. soldiers that is named for a person whose glory came from being a traitor to the United States and killing U.S. soldiers? Why don't we have Osama bin Laden at the World Trade Center? That's the distribution in terms of Confederate states, border states, Union states, and then not a state during the Civil War. You can see where these monuments were built. And so if we're asking the question, why were these monuments built? One of the things that we want as we're thinking about the answer is, well, where were they built? Were they built in the North? Were they built in the West? Why were they only built in the South? And then we have this question: when were these monuments built? There were 2 spikes. between the end of the 1800s and about 1921, and then essentially during the Civil Rights Movement. These monuments weren't built right after the Civil War. These monuments weren't built by people who were directly related to and lived with the people that died in the war. These monuments were built by folks who never knew the men that they were lionizing. (1900 to 1921). You see there, and you won't be able to see the date, but it's 1896. That's Plessy versus Ferguson. And the thing about that is, what I'd like people just to think about when I talk about how white supremacy is so ingrained in American culture that we don't even recognize it anymore. Plessy versus Ferguson was more than 30 years after the Civil War. And I told you the South may have lost the war, but they won the peace. Plessy versus Ferguson said the concept of white supremacy, it's not just the social construct anymore. It is the law of the United States, handed down by the highest court in the land. There is no other way to think about separate but equal. We weren't good enough to be in the same places as the white folks were. And you'll see later that Thurgood Marshall, when he argued Brown versus the board in front of the US Supreme Court, part of his argument was this: separate versus equal was a concept that was derived to try and keep former slaves as close to that state as was humanly possible. Plessy versus Ferguson, the law of the United States.
And I think that integration for us meant freedom from oppression. I don't think that black people really thought of joining the country club or this or that. They thought, get rid of this humiliation. First of all, get some equal education for our children. That everybody knew. That was a goal. Get equal education because that's our future. But don't tell me I can't go to the bathroom anymore. Don't tell me I can't sit anywhere on the bus or in the theater. Don't tell me that. It's just too terrible. I don't think it was a positive thing. I just think it was get rid of all of this oppression. I mean, you cannot understand how horrible it was to have to contemplate a trip south. And the third thing was freedom from fear of being injured in the South. But a trip to the South for a Northerner was fraught with peril because you were worried that your car run out of gas and some person would be violent to you and you have no recourse to the law because the law was totally unfair. And then once you got to the town where you were going to be, if you're wise, you had made arrangements to stay with friends because you couldn't stay at the local hotel. And there was often no public place to eat. Well, we want to be rid of all of that stuff. I think if I thought about it, I would have thought that white people's bad views of black people are based on ignorance. And when we get together, they will cease to be ignorant about us, and the scales will fall from their eyes, and they will begin to be decent.